Hi, welcome to Cultural Anthropology, Chapter 2, Culture. Let's see, we're going to be looking at a variety of different things of various import. First of all, an introduction, understanding ourselves. Americans are encultured to view themselves as individuals. I think I am completely in agreement with Dr. Kotek on this. Americans are rugged. They think of themselves as complete individuals. Now, in contrast, this chapter views people as members of groups first and as individuals second. For example, different national cultures have their own standards for appropriate physical displays of affection, or as we like to say, PDAs. Consequently, the bodily interaction of a Brazilian and an American might lead one to construct the other as either cold or overbearing. Thinking that there is only one right or natural way of doing things is an example of ethnocentrism. What is culture? Now, Dr. Kotek begins with Edward Tyler's definition of culture. That complex whole, which includes knowledge, belief, arts, morals, law, custom, and or any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. Enculturation, enculturation. Enculturation is the process by which a child learns his or her culture. Listen, culture is learned. You don't come into this world with culture absorbed into your pores. It's learned. Cultural learning is unique to humans. Cultural learning is the accumulation of knowledge about experiences and information not perceived directly by the organism, but transmitted to it through symbols. Now, symbols are signs that have no necessary or natural connection with the things that they signify or for which they stand. Anthropologist Clifford Geertz defines culture as ideas that are based on cultural learning and symbols. Culture is learned through direct instruction and observation. Providing conscious and unconscious means for the acquisition of knowledge. Anthropologists accept the doctrine named in the 19th century as the psychic unity of man, which asserts that all human populations share the same capacity for culture. That's not to say their cultures are the same, but they share the capacity for it. Culture is symbolic. The human ability to use symbols is the basis of culture. Kotek defines a symbol as something verbal or nonverbal within a particular language or culture that comes to stand for something else. Now, while human symbol use is usually linguistic, Dr. Kotek notes that a symbol is anything that is used to represent any other thing, when the relationship between the two is arbitrary and conventional. For instance, the book talks about a flag. A flag is a symbol, but it's cultural. It's not linguistic, and yet when you see a flag, you immediately know what it stands for. Other primates have demonstrated the ability to use symbols, but only humans have elaborated cultural abilities such as to learn, to communicate, to store, to process, and to use symbols. Culture is shared. Culture is an attribute not of the individual per se, but of individuals as members of groups. The social transmissions of culture tends to unify people by providing them with common experiences. Such experiences, in turn, shape people's values, memories, and expectations. Now, I know you're sitting there and you're listening to this, and um, I wish that we were able to be interactive. If you have any questions on this, of course you can turn to the textbook because this is right out of the text. But you feel free to shoot me an email. Feel free to comment on anything that I say on the message board or on the discussion board, or give me a call if you have questions. I realize I'm kind of going quickly, but without interaction, it's difficult to gauge how fast one should go. Now let's talk about culture and nature. Cultural habits, perceptions, and inventions mold human nature in many directions. Our culture and cultural changes affect the ways in which we perceive nature, that we perceive human nature, and the way that we perceive the natural world. Culture is all encompassing. The anthropological concept of culture includes all aspects of human social life. Um, Everyone is cultured, not just wealthy people with elite educations. Everyone has a culture. They may be a little bit different. I mean, even I'm speaking to you from Bemidji. And in Bemidji, I would have to say that, how many cultures are represented? You've got various Nordic cultures. I'm not Norwegian. I'm not even native Minnesotan. And so I found it kind of interesting to come here from California where there was such ethnic diversity. And then to come to an area that's largely Scandinavian and of course, the other big group would be Native American. But what's interesting to me, a Scandinavian is a Scandinavian. But man, a Swede here does not consider themselves to be the same as a Finn, who does not consider them the same as Norwegian, and so on and so forth. And probably a lot of you who are watching this are some type of Scandinavian. In California, where I had moved here from, man, every single ethnicity was represented. And so we say culture is all encompassing. That's within a specific group because while everyone has culture, not everyone's culture is exactly the same. But everyone is cultured. Appreciating anthropology. Remote and poked anthropology's dream tribe. The Ariel have been studied for decades because of their relative isolation and nomadic pastoralist economy. Anthropologists from around the world have come to their communities to ask all manners of questions. The Ariel have been studying the anthropologist as well. While these people find anthropologists odd, the only real complaint they have about anthropologists is that some of them fail to share the results of their research. I'm going to recommend a movie for you. It's called The Gods Must Be Crazy. It's about a bushman from the Kalahari tribe, and he's out foraging, and a plane is flying overhead, and the pilot is drinking a Coca-Cola. And he finishes the Coca-Cola, and he drops it out the window and right on the head of the bushman. I mean, but the bushman's never seen a Coke bottle. And to him, it's an amazing thing. And he takes it back to his tribe. And they're all trying to figure out what this thing is that came from the sky, that was dropped by the gods. And, some of them, it's an amazing tool. It's hard, it's an old-fashioned glass Coke bottle. And they're able to use it to smash dough, and they're able to use it to make music. And the problem is that decorations. They turn it over and they use the top for decorations. And the big problem is that, usually within their culture, there is no concept of individual ownership. And yet, everyone wants this. Everyone wants this Coke bottle. So he decides, for the good of the tribe, he's got to give this back to the gods. And so he leaves the bush and he ends up in the city and has all kinds of amusing problems. Watch the movie; it really will illustrate some of these points that the chapter is trying to bring out. Um, Culture is integrated. A culture is an integrated pattern system. Changes in one dimension of culture will likely generate changes in all other dimensions, and that's true of just about everything in life. Core values are sets of ideas, attitudes, symbols, and judgments that further integrate a particular culture and distinguish it from others. Listen, I spent 22 years on active duty in the Navy. And when I went in the Navy, we were taught that there were four core values. Um, Over the years that I was in, they dropped one. You know, uh, each service has a different set of core values: courage, honor, tradition. Tradition was dropped because honor, courage, commitment, and tradition. Those were the Navy core values. Now it's honor, courage, and commitment. Apparently, tradition isn't important anymore. But each armed force has their own set of core values, and each culture. And believe me, being a lifer, that's what we call people who spent at least 20 years being a lifer, you that's a culture. You become enculturated within the armed forces. It was difficult when I retired, and I'm used to telling somebody what to do and having them do it. Now, I retired. I'm a pastor of a church in Bemidji in addition to teaching, and nobody listens. It's like trying to herd cats. And so I had to become encultured to, Minnesota. Not to mention the fact that there's a huge cultural difference between California and Minnesota. Um, Culture is integrated. Now, culture can be both adaptive and maladaptive. In addition to biological adaptations, humans rely on social and cultural means of adaptation. Sometimes adaptive behavior that offers short term benefits to particular individuals may harm the environment and threaten a group's long term survival, thus making certain cultural traits, patterns, and inventions ultimately maladaptive. Culture's evolutionary basis. Now, this is right out of the text. These are Dr. Kotek's opinions. The human capacity for culture has an evolutionary basis that extends back at least 2.5 million years. Similarities between humans and apes are apparent in anatomy, brain structure, genetics, and biochemistry. We are most closely related to chimpanzees and gorillas. We are not, however, chimpanzees and gorillas. Um, Hominids are chimps and gorillas. Hominins is a group that leads to humans, but not chimps and gorillas. Many human traits reflect the fact that our ancestors lived in trees, grasping, manual dexterity, opposable thumbs, depth and color vision, a large brain, substantial parental investment and limited offspring, sociality and cooperation. Now, these are some of these are actually arboreal traits. Now, similarities with other primates. Humans share capacity for learning, capacity to use tools, capacity for hunting. Now, there are differences, however. Um, Cooperation and sharing is much more developed in humans. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, what about wolves? Wolves hunt as a pack. Wolves aren't hominins. Wolves are not hominids. Wolves are different. They do have a pack mentality. Do humans necessarily have a pack mentality? So cooperation and sharing is much more developed in humans. Human females lack a visible estrus cycle and have concealed ovulation, marriage and kinship. Um, In the text, you'll see a recap for a list of similarities and differences. Researchers typically agree on the following sequence for human evolution. I say typically because not all do agree with this. According to Kotek, this is hard fact written in stone, and that's not necessarily true. But around 6 million years ago, our hominin ancestors originated in Africa as ape-like creatures, and they became biped. By 2.5 million years ago, hominins were making crude stone tools. By 1.7 million years ago, hominins had spread from Africa into Asia and eventually into Europe. Sometime after 200,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans evolved from ancestors who remained in Africa. There is considerable disagreement regarding when, where, and how anatomically modern humans, or AMH, achieved um, behavioral modernity, relying on symbolic thought, elaborating cultural creativity, and becoming fully human uh, in behavior as well as in anatomy. Now, Richard Klein argues that human creativity dawned suddenly in Europe around 45,000 years ago. Klein argues that around 50,000 BP, genetic mutation rewired the human brain, allowing for advances in language. This improved communication gave humans the capacity for behavioral modernity. The fossil record does not support this model. AMH skulls from this time period show no change in brain size or function. This is just an idea that Klein has. It's interesting, but it's all conjecture. There's no proof of this. Competing claims cite evidence from Africa and Mideast showing modern behavior in the form of finely made stone and bone tools, self-ornamentation, abstract carvings, symbolic behavior, and artistic creativity. Discoveries in 2007 show even earlier evidence. Small stone bladelets, red ochre body pigment, and dietary evidence dating to 164000 BP for behavioral modernity as a pinnacle point, and this occurs in South Africa. Now, Clive Gamble attributes the rise of modern human behavior to increasing social competition, leading to new subsistence strategies. That's just a fancy way of saying um, subsistence, new ways of coming up with food, new subsistence strategies, and new ways of sharing ideals and organizing society. Now, I do believe that we need to speak professionally, but see, it's things like competition leading to new subsistence strategies that puts people off. We could just say modern ways of feeding ourselves. It means exactly the same thing. The origin of human modernity continues to be debated. New section: universality, generality, and particularity. 1. Introduction. Cultural universals are certain biological, psychological, social, and cultural features that are found in every culture. Cultural generalities include features that are common to several, but not all human groups. Cultural particularities are features that are unique to certain cultural traditions. Now, when we talk about universal culture, um, cultural universals are traits that more or less distinguish Homo sapiens from other species. Some biologically based universals include a long period of infant dependency, year round mating, and a complex brain that enables us to use symbols, languages, and tools. In other words, we are able to see the abstract. Our very young aren't, but as we develop intellectually, we are able to see the abstract. By that, um, maybe you're wondering exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about abstracts. Um, High levels of math, anything other than 3 apples and 2 apples equals 5 apples. Algebra requires abstract thought. You can't see it, and yet you are able to discuss it and able to understand it. Let's see. Some psychological universals or universal concepts involve common ways in which humans think, feel, and process information. In part, reflecting such biological universals, has the structure of the human brain. Some social universals include incest taboos, life in groups, families of some kind, and food sharing. Now let's talk about generality. Certain practices may occur in different times and places, but not be universal. These are called generalities. Cultural generalities may arise through diffusion, that is cultural borrowing, an independent invention, and we'll discuss more about this. But Kotak identifies the nuclear family as one cultural generality that is present in many, but not all societies. It's almost a universal, the nuclear family concept, but not always. Very consistent. uh, Particularity, practices that are unique to a single place, to a single culture or society, are cultural particulars. We usually move from the general to the particular. Cultures are integrated and patterned differently and display tremendous variation and diversity. Culture and the individual, agency and practice. Humans have the ability to avoid, manipulate, subvert, and change the rules and patterns of their own cultures. Culture is contested, and supposedly common symbols may have radically different meanings to different individuals and groups within the same culture. Let's go back to the flag. Does the flag mean the same thing to everyone that looks at it? Some anthropologists find it useful to distinguish between ideal culture, or the normative descriptions of a culture given by its people, and real culture, or behavior as observed by an anthropologist. Ideal, think of this. If you know that you're being observed, are you going to be on your best behavior, or are you going to act as you normally would act? That's the difference between ideal and real. Culture may be described as having interrelated public and individual dimensions. Contemporary anthropologists tend to view culture as a process in action, practice, and resistance, rather than as an entity transmitted across generations. Dr. Kotak defines agency as the actions that individuals take, both alone and in groups, in forming and transforming cultural identities. Practice theory is an approach to culture that focuses on how varied individuals, through their ordinary and extraordinary actions and practices, manage to influence, create, and transform the world in which they live. Let's talk about levels of culture. National culture refers to the experiences, beliefs, learned behavior patterns, values, and institutions that are shared by citizens of the same nation. International culture refers to cultural practices that extend beyond and across national boundaries. Subcultures are identifiable cultural patterns and traditions associated with particular groups in the same complex society. Now, there's another section of the text, appreciating diversity, culture clash. Maka seek return to wailing past. Now, while cultures have never been isolated, local groups have increasingly had to contend with national and international groups having their own sets of customs and beliefs. In a dispute between the Maka and animal rights groups, we see conflicting claims about which rights: animal, cultural, economic, legal, and human. Which of these should take precedence? Moving on to ethnocentrism, cultural relativism, and human rights. Ethnocentrism is the tendency to view one's own culture as superior and to apply one's own values in judging the behavior and beliefs of people raised within other cultures. What may seem alien to us might appear normal, proper, and prized elsewhere. The fact of cultural diversity calls ethnocentrism into question. What happens when cultural practices, values, and rights come into conflict with human rights? Some cultures, for instance, in the Middle East and in Africa, have customs requiring female uh, genital modification. Of course, we would say that that's absolutely wrong. There are movements in the United States to specifically taking place in San Francisco, California, to say that it's not permissible for any cultures to circumcise. That's exactly what we're talking about here. Um, Genital modification would be considered normal in the Middle East and in Africa, and yet we would have issues with it. Now, these procedures are traditional where practiced, but opposed by human rights advocates for infringing on the basic human right to control one's body and sexuality. The concept of cultural relativism asserts that behavior in one culture should not be judged by the standards of another. Um, Cultural relativism is not a moral position in anthropology, but a methodological one. Um, in order to understand a culture, we must try to understand how people in that culture see things. The concept of human rights invokes the realm of justice and morality superior to countries, cultures, and religions. Rights that are vested in the individual. Except in our society, more and more and more often, we say that we value diversity, and yet, do we truly value diversity? Um, Cultural rights are vested not in individuals, not but I'm trying to put my thoughts in order, I'm sorry, but in groups, and include a group's ability to preserve its cultural traditions. Kotak argues that an understanding of cultural relativism and cultural rights does not preclude an anthropologist from making a judgment based on what he refers to as international standards of justice and morality. I find this interesting that Kotak would say this because he, in all other areas, he would say, no, 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 we must recognize, that culture is relative. And yet, he has a caveat here. He's saying, except when it goes against international standards. At what point do international standards outweigh local custom and local tradition. That's something you, as individuals, are going to have to come to grips with. Mechanisms of cultural change. First of all, we're going to talk about diffusion, then we're going to talk about acculturation. Independent invention. These are all areas of mechanism of cultural change, mechanisms, excuse me. First, we're going to talk about diffusion. Diffusion is defined as the spread of cultural traits through borrowing between cultures and has been a source of cultural change throughout human history. Diffusion can be direct, such as when two cultures trade, when they intermarry, when they wage war on one another, or indirect, when cultural practices or traits move from Group A to Group C via Group B without any first-hand contact between Groups A and Group C. Diffusion can be forced when one culture subjugates another and imposes its customs on the dominated group, as through warfare or colonization. Now, acculturation is the exchange of cultural features that results when groups come into continuous first-hand contact. Acculturation may occur in any or all groups engaged in such contact. Pidgin is an example of acculturation because it is a language that develops by blending elements from different languages in order to facilitate communication between the populations in contact, such as in trade relationships. Independent invention is the process by which humans innovate, creatively finding solutions to problems. Cultural generalities are partly explained by the independent invention of similar responses to comparable cultural and environmental circumstances. The independent invention of agriculture in the Middle East and in Mexico is an example. Where did it come first? We think they came at about the same time. Where was the wheel invented? Was it invented in one area, or was it invented in a variety at about the same time? Globalization encompasses a series of processes that work to promote change in a world in which nations and people are increasingly interlinked and mutually dependent. Promoting such linkages are economic and political forces, along with modern systems of transportation and communication. People must increasingly cope with forces generated by progressively larger systems, the region, the nation, and the world. It's not like we are isolated and can just hang out within one culture. Communications have improved, the world has gotten smaller, if you will, and we must face these realities. And finally, new forms of political mobilization and cultural expression are emerging from the interplay of local, regional, national, and international cultural forces. Well, that ends Chapter 2 lecture. Read the book and shoot me any questions that you may have. Have a tremendous day.